Right, let's dive into Cuba today. We're going way beyond, those typical touristy brochures. Really get into it. I've got like a whole stack of sources here. We've got some history, some economics, even some snapshots of their culture, and a little bit about their military and political scene too. But before we get into all that, just off the top of your head, what comes to mind when I say Cuba? Like, what's the first thing?
It's funny you should mention that, because even just the name Cuba itself has a whole backstory. There are a bunch of theories about where it came from. Some folks think it's from indigenous languages, meaning like large place.
Oh, interesting.
But others think it could even be linked back to Christopher Columbus. Maybe he named it after his birthplace.
Wait, hold on. Columbus might have named Cuba after, like, his hometown. That's kind of crazy. Okay, let's back up for a sec. Just geographically speaking, where exactly are we talking about when we say Cuba?
So Cuba is the biggest island in the Caribbean, right between the Caribbean Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean. And it's got these amazing mountain ranges like the Sierra Maestra, which is home to Pico Chiquino, the highest peak in Cuba, almost 2,000 meters high.
Wow, that's got to be an incredible view from up there. And what about the cities? I know Havana is the capital, but what other cities should we be thinking about as we learn more about Cuba?
Well, besides Havana, which has over 2 million people, there's Santiago de Cuba, Camagüey, and Holguín. Each city has its own vibe and a unique history. Oh, and of course, there's Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, leased by the U.S. since 1934, though Cuba actually contests the validity of that lease.
Right, Guantanamo. Definitely a place with a controversial history for sure. So we've got geography, we've got a potential royal connection. That's a lot already. But before we get too deep into things, what's the climate like in Cuba?
Let's imagine we're in Havana. We can expect pretty warm weather year-round, somewhere in the mid-20s to low 30s Celsius. But definitely pack an umbrella, because they've got a really defined wet season from June to October. Like over 100 rainy days a year.
Got it. So beachwear and a raincoat, just in case. Now let's talk about the people. Over 10 million. Anything else we should know about the population?
Yeah, over 10 million people call Cuba home. But there's been a noticeable dip in the population lately. Over 1 million people have left in just the past few years. Mostly because of the economic crisis that's happening right now. It's a real challenge for a lot of Cubans.
1 million people leaving in just a few years that's a huge number. Really gives you a sense of the situation there. Now, I'm curious about religion and politics. What are the main religions there, and how does the government actually work?
So in Cuba, you see a real mix of religions. Catholicism is the most common, but we're seeing more and more Protestant churches popping up. And get this, there are over 96,000 Jehovah's Witnesses.
Wow, that's a lot of different faiths. And politically, I know it's a socialist state, but what does that mean in terms of like how things actually run?
Cuba is often called a bureaucratically authoritarian state. It's a one-party system led by the Communist Party of Cuba. So even though they have elections, the real power sits with the Communist Party. And there's not a ton of room for people to disagree with the government. The state and ministerial councils are really where the power is. And it's interesting, a lot of the same people hold high-ranking positions in both the party and the government.
It's a lot to unpack. But I'm guessing this all ties into Cuba's relationship with the United States, especially with the whole embargo thing, right?
Absolutely. The embargo and how Cuba sees the U.S. interfering in their affairs, it's led to like a lot of nationalistic feelings, and definitely some anti-American sentiment. It's a super complicated relationship with a long history, which actually brings us to the next part of our deep dive, Cuba's, journey through time.
Yeah, let's get into that history. We've got to talk about their fight for independence and, of course, the revolution that basically changed everything. Where should we start?
Well, we could start with their fight for independence from Spain. Guys like José Martí, he was a poet and a revolutionary. He became a symbol of how much Cubans wanted to be free. He and other leaders fought against Spain for a long time, and finally, in 1898, Spain gave up its control over Cuba.
1898, a big year. And that's when the U.S. got involved, right? After the Spanish-American War.
Exactly. The U.S. was actually occupying Cuba until 1902, when Cuba officially became independent. But there was a catch. The U.S. made Cuba add something called the Platt Amendment to their constitution. Basically, it gave the U.S. the power to intervene in Cuba whenever they wanted. So Cuba was independent, but not totally free. And, that's something that still impacts how the U.S. and Cuba relate to each other today.
So independence, but not complete freedom. Sounds like a tough situation from the start. And then, of course, there's the revolution, the event that, a lot of people see as the defining moment for modern Cuba. Can you walk us through that?
In 1959, Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, Camilo Cienfuegos, and the famous Che Guevara, they led this revolution that overthrew the Batista dictatorship and created a socialist state. This revolution changed everything, not just inside Cuba, but all over the world.
It's amazing how one event can have such a huge impact, globally.
Sure.
What were some of the biggest outcomes, both within Cuba and internationally?
Within Cuba, the revolution led to the government taking control of industries and land reform. It completely changed their economic and social structures. Internationally, it really broke things off between Cuba and the U.S., eventually leading to the embargo that's still going on today. At the same time, Cuba got really close with the Soviet Union and became a major player in the Cold War.
It's like a chain reaction. One event triggering all these other events that are still shaping Cuba even today. To really understand the situation in Cuba now, we need to talk about their economy. How does it work, and what are some of the things that make it so unique?
Cuba has what's called a planned economy. It's had its ups and downs, and they're trying to make some changes to it now. One of the most interesting things about their economy is the two types of currency they use.
Two types of currency. That sounds maybe a little complicated.
It is. They have the Cuban peso, or CUP, and then there's the convertible peso, the CUC. The idea was for the CUC to be used alongside the CUP, but then eventually they were going to phase it out. But having these two currencies running at the same time, it's created a really complicated situation for Cubans. It can be hard to know what you can buy with each currency. And then on top of all that, there's the U.S. embargo, which makes things even tougher economically.
Yeah, that embargo is a constant reminder of the tension between the two countries. How does it impact the lives of everyday Cubans and the overall economy?
Well, the embargo limits Cuba's access to a lot of important stuff, things like medical supplies and technology. It affects everything, even infrastructure. And of course, it makes it way harder for them to trade with other countries and get foreign investment, which definitely limits their economic growth.
So it seems like Cubans are dealing with all these different factors, some internal, some external, that really affect their lives. And, despite all that, I've also heard that Cuba has made big investments in things like education and healthcare. Can you tell us more about that?
Even with limited resources, Cuba has really prioritized social programs, and they've accomplished some pretty amazing things. For example, their literacy rate is 99.8%, one of the highest in the world. And they have a healthcare system that's well known for covering everyone and focusing on preventative care. They're really proud of these achievements.
That's really impressive. It's inspiring to see a nation that cares so much about its people's well-being, especially with all the economic challenges. And of course, we have to talk about tourism. I mean, those pictures of those classic cars driving around Havana and those incredible beaches, it's pretty alluring. What kind of role does tourism play in Cuba's economy and culture?
Tourism is huge for Cuba. They've got those amazing beaches, beautiful scenery, historical sites, and of course those iconic classic cars. It's a really unique experience for tourists. Lately, there have been more and more visitors from the U.S., especially Cuban Americans, going back to visit family.
That's really interesting. It seems like tourism gives people a window into Cuba's rich culture. What can you tell us about the music and culture that makes this island nation so special? What are the sounds, the traditions, the things that make Cuba stand out?
Cuban music is just this incredible mix of sounds and influences. They've got traditional son and salsa, and then the newer reggaeton. And it's not just stayed in Cuba, Cuban music has traveled all over the world and influenced tons of artists in different genres.
It's like a musical melting pot, It shows how diverse their heritage is and how they've adapted and changed over time. We've covered a lot already. The name Cuba, the political system, the economy, their culture. It's amazing how it all comes together to make such a fascinating country. But I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, definitely. But at least we've got a good starting point for understanding this incredible island nation. Cuba's story is still unfolding, and the choices they make now will shape their future.
I think we need to pause here and let all this information sink in for a bit. When we come back, we'll dive even deeper into some of these topics and uncover even more fascinating facts and insights. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Cuba.
Yeah, I'm ready to get into some more details now.
Yeah.
We were talking about Cuba's political system before the break and how the Communist Party's in charge. But how do elections actually work there?
It's not quite like the elections you might be used to, in a multi-party democracy. Remember those committees for the defense of the revolution? The CDRs. They're actually a big part of how elections work.
Oh, right, the CDRs. They're those neighborhood groups that, kind of keep an eye on things, right?
Exactly. So the CDRs, they organize meetings in each municipality, and any citizen can nominate someone to run for office. But here's the thing. The vote on those nominees, it happens right there, out in the open. No secret ballot. And only the people who get at least half the votes in that open forum can even get on the ballot for the National Assembly elections.
So basically, even before Cubans get to vote secretly, the candidates have already been pre-screened in a very public way. How does that affect who ends up running?
Well, considering the political climate, it's not really a surprise that anyone who's against the government has a really hard time getting elected, and it doesn't stop there. When it comes to campaigning, only state-run media can cover anything about the election. The candidates themselves aren't allowed to campaign.
Really? So no rallies, no billboards, no social media?
Nope. The government says it's to make things fair, so people with more money don't have an unfair advantage.
But doesn't that also make it harder to criticize the government? What information do voters actually get about the candidates?
All they get is the candidate's name, age, what they do for work, and their education. No information about their political views or what they plan to do if they get elected. So it's more about their background than, what they stand for.
That's a very different way of doing elections. What do international organizations think about this system?
There have been some criticisms, yeah. The UN Human Rights Commission, for example, they say these elections aren't truly democratic. They argue that the results are basically already decided, and the system is designed to keep the same people in power.
So it all comes back to the Communist Party controlling everything, huh? How does this affect political opposition in Cuba?
Organized political opposition, like you see in a multi-party system, it's just not allowed in Cuba. Any party or organization that's against the government is considered illegal.
And what about people who do speak out against the government or advocate for different political ideas?
There have been reports of the government cracking down on dissent. People have been arrested and imprisoned for speaking out against the state. Groups like the Ladies in White have gotten international attention for their peaceful protests, but they often face harassment and detention.
It sounds like a really tough environment for anyone who doesn't agree with the government. How does all this political control affect the media in Cuba?
All media in Cuba is controlled by the state. It's even written in their constitution. That means newspapers, TV, radio, even the internet, it's all heavily regulated, and they mainly promote what the government wants people to hear. Independent journalism, especially anything critical of the government, is basically shut down.
So they're not just controlling what information is out there, they're also limiting access to different perspectives. How do they control information coming from outside Cuba?
They use different methods. For example, Radio Martí. It's a US-funded radio station that broadcasts news and information into Cuba, and the Cuban government tries to block it all the time.
It's like a battle over who gets to control the narrative. But with the internet becoming so widespread, haven't Cubans found ways to access information despite all these restrictions?
The internet has definitely given Cubans some ways to connect with the outside world and share their own views, but it's not easy. Internet access is limited and expensive. The government controls the internet providers, and they block a lot of websites, especially ones that criticize the government or share dissenting opinions.
So even with the internet, the government still has a pretty tight grip on information. How do all these political and economic realities affect everyday life for ordinary Cubans?
It's complicated. On the one hand, you have those amazing achievements in education and healthcare, the high literacy rate and universal healthcare, that's really impressive. But a lot of times those achievements are overshadowed by how hard it is for a lot of Cubans to make ends meet.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine those two realities existing side by side. Can you give us some specific examples of how the economic situation affects people's daily lives?
Well, take the dual currency system, for example. It creates a lot of inequality. What you can buy and the services you have access to, it can be really different depending on which currency you have. And basic necessities are often scarce, which leads to long lines and a lot of frustration.
I've heard about shortages and rationing in Cuba. Is that still something people deal with today?
Unfortunately, yes. Cubans rely on a ration system for basic goods, but there's not always enough to go around, and the quality can be unpredictable.
That must be incredibly difficult to live with that kind of uncertainty all the time. And then there's the pressure of the U.S. embargo. How does that affect everyday life in a practical way?
The embargo makes it harder to get a lot of things from medicine and technology to just basic consumer goods. It also makes it harder for their economy to grow and limits opportunities for trade and investment.
So it's like a whole web of challenges, both inside and outside the country. And it's probably a big part of why so many people are leaving Cuba to find a better life somewhere else.
Absolutely. Over 1 million people leaving, that really tells you how difficult things are for a lot of Cubans. They're looking for better jobs, more freedom, and a future that feels more stable and hopeful.
It's a reminder that these political and economic situations have a real human cost. But even with all these hardships, I've also heard about some positive changes happening in Cuba, like more private businesses opening up. Could that be a sign that things are starting to improve?
It's definitely something to keep an eye on. Allowing some private enterprise has created new opportunities for some Cubans, and it's brought some energy into the economy. But the government still has a lot of control over private businesses, and the reforms are limited.
So it's a step towards more open economy, but they're moving slowly and carefully. And that brings up a really important question. What's next for Cuba? Can they hold on to their socialist system and also adapt to a globalized world?
That's the big question, isn't it? Some people are pushing for more political and economic freedom, while others are still committed to the ideals of the revolution. Cuba's at a crossroads. They've got some tough choices to make about their future.
It's definitely a complex and fascinating situation. And even with all the challenges, the resilience of the Cuban people is pretty amazing. They've managed to create a really vibrant culture and a strong sense of community.
That's so true. Cuba is a country of contrasts and contradictions. It's hard to put it in a box. Their history continues to shape their present, and the decisions they make today will determine what their future looks like.
You know, we've been talking about a lot of serious topics, but we can't forget about the heart and soul of Cuba, their culture. Let's shift gears and talk about the music, art, and traditions that have made them who they are and captured the attention of the world.
I like that idea. Cuban culture is all about resilience, creativity, and the human spirit.
I can't wait to dive into that world of rhythm, color, and passion. Stay with us. All right, we're back and ready to really get into the heart of Cuba, their culture. And when I think Cuban music, like the first thing that pops into my head is Buena Vista Social Club. Those rhythms are just so catchy.
Oh yeah, Buena Vista Social Club. They definitely put traditional Cuban sun on the map. But honestly, there's a whole world of musical genres in Cuba, each one reflecting like different parts of their heritage.
Okay, I'm ready for that musical journey. What are some of the sound that really define Cuba?
Well, son is like the foundation. It's a mix of Spanish and African influences, and a lot of other genres grew out of it. Then you've got salsa, which was born in the streets of Havana, just full of passion and energy. And of course, we can't forget about rumba, with its deep African roots and that amazing improvisational style.
It's really amazing how their music tells the story of how all these different cultures came together to create Cuba. And what about the visual arts? What kind of art should we expect to see in Cuba?
Cuban art is known for, well, it's bold. Lots of color, expressive figures, and you'll often see political messages woven into the artwork. There's a strong tradition of social realism, showing everyday life and struggles, and a lot of art that celebrates Afro-Cuban culture and spirituality. And lately, there's been this surge in contemporary art that's really pushing boundaries, challenging the norms.
Sounds like Cuban art is just as dynamic and complex as the country itself, always changing and reflecting what's happening in society.
Exactly. And speaking of reflecting change, we gotta talk about those classic cars, those amazing vintage cars cruising around Havana. They're more than just a pretty sight, They tell a story about resilience and making do with what you have.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious about that. What's the story behind those classic cars?
So after the revolution and with the U.S. embargo, it became almost impossible for Cubans to get new cars or parts. So they had to improvise. They became like masters at keeping those old American cars running, sometimes for decades, using whatever they could find.
Wow, talk about resourcefulness. That's such a unique part of Cuban culture, and it's definitely something that captures the imagination of visitors.
Definitely. It shows how even when times are tough, culture finds a way to survive and express itself.
We've covered so much in this deep dive into Cuba. We've talked about their history, their political and economic systems, and the amazing tapestry of their culture. It's been a journey full of contradictions, but also, inspiring stories of resilience.
It really has. I hope our listeners have a better understanding of Cuba now, a country that's really hard to define and continues to change and adapt, even with all the challenges they face.
It's a good reminder that there's always more to learn and that looking at things from different perspectives can really open your mind. What do you think is the biggest takeaway from our deep dive? What really stood out to you?
For me, it's how much Cuba's history still impacts their present. I mean, from Spanish colonialism to the revolution and the embargo that's still going on, those events have shaped their society, their politics, their economy in such a unique way. It continues to define them today.
It reminds us to look beyond the headlines and easy assumptions, to really appreciate how complex a place like Cuba is. And even with all that complexity, the human spirit still finds a way to shine through.
That's so true. Their vibrant culture, their resilience, their strong sense of who they are, it's a testament to the human spirit for sure.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Cuba. But we want to leave you with something to think about. Knowing what you know now about Cuba, how do you think they'll handle the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century? How will they find that balance between their revolutionary past and the forces of globalization and change? It's a question we're thinking about as Cuba continues to write its story.
And it's a story I think we'll all be watching closely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Cuba. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep seeking out those different perspectives. Until next time, happy exploring.